Hello and welcome to the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. As many of you already know, but in case those who don't, my name is Eric Story. I'm the Outreach Manager here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada and your host for this evening. We at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada would like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we recognize the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples and cultures here. The consequences of the long colonial relationship between the Government of Canada and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are far-reaching and painful. We are committed to reconciliation through the establishment and maintenance of a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So tonight is the holiday edition of the speaker series, the final event in the 2024 calendar. And earlier this afternoon, I was sort of thinking, how could I introduce myself? How can I welcome folks to the audience? Well, I thought I'd do a little bit of reflection on what we were able to do this year. So as always, we ran our speaker series. We brought 7 speakers in and took a look at the stats, and we had 486 folks tuning in, almost 500. Both in person and for those who are tuning in on Zoom. And so it's, people coming in from the region, from locally, but also tuning in across the world because of Zoom. In addition to that, we had 1,311 views on YouTube of these events. And, it's a testament to the power of the technology that really forced us to embrace because of COVID. But I think it also speaks to the value that I hope we give to you when we put on these events every single month throughout the academic year. We brought in Graham Broad last year from Western. We brought in Jeff Hayes, of course, from the University of Waterloo. Cindy Camacchio, retired from Wilfrid Laurier University. And then last month, Matt Wiseman to launch his first book on Canada's Arctic soldiers. But it was really cool to talk to some of the folks in the audience tonight. In particular because some of you said that this was the first time coming back to the center since COVID. And we've been trying hard to get many of you folks back who haven't been here since then. And I guess all it takes is a little bit of Tim Cook. So our speaker tonight, as you all are aware, is Tim Cook. He's the Director of Research at the Canadian War Museum. He was the curator for the First World War Permanent Gallery at the museum and has curated additional temporary, traveling, and digital exhibitions. He's the author of 19 books, including museum books, edited collections, and he's the recipient of many awards and distinctions, including, but certainly not limited to, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award and the Pierre Berton Award. He's the director for Canada's History Society, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and a member of the Order of Canada. And tonight, he's going to be discussing, as I said, his 19th book, titled The Good Allies. We fortunately brought in the bookshelf from Guelph. Thank you for coming in. We'll be selling his books tonight. Stick around. Tim will be more than happy to sign copies of those books, and the bookshelf will be very happy to sell them to you. I will not keep you any longer from our special guest tonight, so I'll turn things over to Dr. Tim Cook.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. It's a great pleasure to return here to Waterloo and to speak at the university in the center here. I gave my first academic paper here at Laurier in 1995. That was a long time ago. But it's nice to see at least one old friend from those days, Dr. Mike Bechtold, and perhaps others. There are former colleagues here, my old boss, Dr. Roger Sardi, people who I've been on battlefield tours with, students I have worked with, scholars whose works I have read and admired, and always a great pleasure to speak to you as a group, some faces I recognize from years in the past. As Eric said, this is my 19th book, edited, written, and they're all different. Sometimes I get asked, do you have a favorite book, Tim? And it's a bit like asking if I have a favorite kid. I have 3 of them. It depends on how I'm feeling that day. But they all remind me of a time in my life, as I have been doing this with the first book out in 1999, but really I was working on it from 1995. And most of them have a question that you're trying to answer. Sometimes I get asked that, how do you pick your book topics? Sometimes it's a question. I think of my Vimy book, The Ballad and the Legend, where I wanted to explore Vimy and why we talked about it the way we did, why some people talked about it as the birth of the nation. What do we mean by that? So I explored that in that book. The Secret History of Soldiers was really culmination of 20 years of research into soldiers and how they lived and how they died, how they coped and how they endured on the Western Front. And I won't go through every book, don't worry. Sometimes I write books because I want to find out about the topic. This book emerged from 2 things. One was a museum visit to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's a fabulous museum. I don't know if you've been there. That's the one Spielberg and Hanks are associated with. They have more money than God. They just great exhibitions and films, directed by Spielberg, and Hanks is involved. It's quite remarkable. And I went through it pretty carefully because I'm a museum guy, and I found only 2 references to Canada in the entire museum. It goes on and on and on and on. And it's supposed to be encyclopedic. It's not just about the American war effort, although that's a significant part of it. And I left there thinking, okay, I don't expect the Americans to know our history. That may be naive, but I do think they should know something about Canada's incredible contributions during the Second World War, or World War II, as they call it, and a war that didn't start in 1941. So I came back and I thought, I'm going to work on that. Now, I wrote a few other books, but I began thinking about it, exploring it, genuinely afraid of the enormous literature that has been written on the Second World War, and thinking, would this be a military book? Would it be about politics, Mackenzie King and Roosevelt? Would it be about diplomacy? What about wartime trade? What about our industrial contributions? What about the East Coast and the West Coast? Jesus, what about sovereignty in the North? What about our fighting forces overseas, where we fight with the Americans in places? And I decided to write about all of that. So that's the book. It's a big book, and I want to tell you a bit about it. It's an exploration of this really critical relationship. And as I wasn't new to the Second World War, written or published 10 books on it. I know how it ends. But there's a lot, most of those books explore, you might call it the transatlantic relationship, right? Canada and Britain. I mean, that's most of what those books are about. How we deal with the British, how our fighting forces are integrated within the British fighting forces, and where we fight for autonomy, and other elements there. And I thought there really needs to be an exploration of the North-South, over the 49th, over the border, that 9,000 kilometer long border. How did we secure North America? Because that was a finding that I didn't anticipate, but I began to reflect on that. We couldn't have sent those expeditionary forces abroad unless North America was secure. And how was that done? So those were some of the starting places. I said there were 2 things that motivated me. So the first was the World War II Museum. The second one was the Trump administration and the inflicting of tariffs on our steel. And I thought treating us fairly despicably, almost like an enemy nation, and not as the good allies that I thought we were. There is a little bit of irony here, as you know. And I am aware that this book has come out, and I meant for it to come out in September of 2024. I meant for it to come out aware that there would be an incendiary election to the South with verbal bombs hurled back and forth, where Canada would get caught in the crossfire. And I thought, in a very small way, maybe if I could write this book for it to come out, might remind some people that we were good allies during the Second World War, and I'll come back to that, and we have been ever since. But that might be an area in the question period we might want to talk about a little bit. I have had a chance to, been invited to Washington to give talks there. It's been well received. I spoke, and Rod, you're going to like this, to the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, which was created during the Second World War in August of 1940, and is still around today. And it's about negotiating the security issues in the Northern Hemisphere. So all that is to say, those are some of the background ideas that underpin this book. And you might, Matt, we're going to try that. And it gives you maybe a bit of a sense. And we could talk more about that in the question period too. If you want to talk about how I work, how I write, being a public historian, whatever you like. Question period is up to you, although I will take a maximum of 2 questions. No. That's it. This is being broadcast as well. That's an old-fashioned word, isn't it? I'm showing my age. Sent out there. And so hello to those people who, Wes Cross in Montreal sent me an email, said he was sitting down with some popcorn to watch me. And I thought, that's not a bad idea. Maybe guys, we should be serving some popcorn next time here. So I talked about Second World War or World War II or 39 to 45 or 41 to 45. Those are some minor differences between Canada and the US. There are far more commonalities, partnerships, and alliances. And this is a book that tries to explore them and how the North Americans came together to first jointly defend the Northern Hemisphere, involving the supercharging of our war economies to produce critical weapons, and then to take the fight to the enemies abroad in order to liberate the oppressed. A terrible price was paid, as you know, in this war of utter necessity, but it was paid together by the North Americans. Now, it must be said that for much of our history, up to the 20th century, the two nations have been bad neighbors, right? A relationship plagued by war and conflict and aggression. And this, of course, is a great painting of the Battle of Queenston Heights. But slowly, cautious diplomacy, entwined trade, and growing friendship. By that, the early 20th century, including minor treaties, we began to see this relationship develop as the two countries learned to navigate living together. And it wasn't easy. And as part of my research, I really enjoyed discovering and reading again the invasion plans. And you know, these are not the actual plans. These are images of them. Canada had Defense Scheme Number 1, which was an ambitious plan from the early 1920s, where we were going to send flying columns across the border to capture key cities and towns and bridges, and hold on like dear hell for the Royal Navy to come and sail across to bombard the eastern seaboard. And also, it would appear, although the Australians don't seem to know this, the Australians were supposed to send an expeditionary force to invade California. It's a pretty good plan, except we had no armored forces or mobile units. And in fact, no one had actually worked out what would be captured. That was going to be left to the divisional commanders, of which we had no real fighting divisions. The American plan was more developed, and it's an interesting document to read. As you can see, it's wide-ranging. Vancouver and Victoria were quickly going to fall with a cross-border invasion. Halifax, our key city, especially if we're thinking of the Royal Navy, would be doused in chemical weapons from aerial dispersed bombers. Winnipeg would be captured, cutting the country in half, and then Ottawa would be marched upon, and only 200 kilometers or so from the border. And that was a better plan. The Americans still didn't have those fighting forces to do it, but it was more developed, really part of the plan to fight Britain, which is on the books until the mid-1930s. So quite remarkable, but very unlikely to be used. Although I write about in the book a series of interesting testimonials from, I think it was US Air Force officers who talked openly of how they would capture Canada. And Roosevelt said that was irresponsible talk, President Roosevelt, of course, and they were forced to apologize. Nonetheless, these were not likely to happen by the 1930s, and we had found a way really to share that 9,000-kilometer border. And the Second World War is really the turning point, I would argue, in our history to becoming more North American, fully North American. And I'll come back to that. A key part of this relationship is William Lyon Mackenzie King, our longest serving prime minister, and President Roosevelt. And they had an unlikely friendship. Now, I go way back with Mackenzie King, back to my second year Canadian history course at Trent University, where my very fine professor, John Jennings, who I saw about 3 weeks ago when I was giving a talk at Trent, he introduced me to Mackenzie King. And Kevin, you will remember that, I think. He hated Mackenzie King. Oh, he hated Mackenzie King. All the reasons why you could hate Mackenzie King. He wasn't charismatic. He pales in comparison to Churchill and Roosevelt especially, more comfortable leading from the rear, a quizzling of the worst type, willing to throw friends, colleagues under the bus for political survival, and more. And of course, there are other elements there. And yet, the more you look at Mackenzie King, especially during the Second World War, and especially in relation to Canadian-American relations, you see his skill as a political leader, as a leader who could suffer tactical defeats for strategic victories, a leader who built a very strong cabinet, a leader who understood when he was reelected again in late 35, early 36, that he had to strengthen the relationship with the United States. And he goes about doing that because Washington didn't care much about us, far more interested in their foreign policy with Latin America, and far more interested with the rise of the fascists, the Italians, of course, from the early 20s with Mussolini, Hitler coming to power in 33, the war between Japan and China, either 31 or 37, pick your date, the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39. That's the focus of the United States. And as an aside, as I was reading through the vast literature on American foreign policy, I was struck over and over again of how they just don't write about Canada. They just don't care. It's a blind spot. We're just assumed that we will always be there. I think it's pretty obvious. But we weren't always there. Where we take that is during the Second World War. Maybe we'll come back to that point in a bit. But it's Mackenzie King who finds a way to elbow his way into Washington and to begin to forge those economic ties. But it wouldn't have happened without Roosevelt as well. That's important. And this is a lovely cartoon here. Two kinds of frontiers. We've got King and Roosevelt shaking hands. There's smiley, happy people in the back, presumably prosperous workers. And then any European frontier here, the soldiers marching back and forth. It captures, I think, this emerging friendship at the highest levels, which is important. It was important then and remains important now, that kind of summit diplomacy between leaders. Now, Roosevelt, he knew Canada better than most presidents in the past, and he understood, even though his White House administration didn't seem to understand this, that he needed a strong Canada on the northern border. And he works with Mackenzie King, but he's also subtly harassing him. And Roger Sardi has written the best work published on this in the 1930s, on how Roosevelt's pressure, the American pressure, that begins to force Canada to rearm. We do it slow. The Quebec side of the caucus is very much against this. And yet, this rearmament happens. And we realize, despite the fact that we are largely protected from our greatest shield, geography, the Atlantic, that we have a problem. The problem, of course, is Hitler. And I talk about this in the book, and Mackenzie King, his relationship with Roosevelt. He makes a visit to Hitler in 1937 in Berlin. It's quite a remarkable meeting. He goes there hoping he can talk some sense into Hitler. He sees him as a kindred spirit. They're both spiritualist. And one of the greatest documents, I think the greatest document in Canadian history, is Mackenzie King's diary. And you'll remember he kept it his whole life. 50 years, 30,000 pages, and I've read thousands and thousands of pages of it. It's incredible. It's an amazing document. Every single person he met that day, those who slighted him in the smallest way, those who gave him a little pep talk, right? And his agonies are poured out there as well, where he feels he has failed. He was a deeply lonely man. Never married, no kids. You see that. He's desperately lonely. The diary is a cathartic release for him to put down those thoughts. And he writes about meeting Hitler, and it's agonizing. Oh, it's just gut-churning, right? Hitler's blue eyes. I see a man of peace. He's misunderstood. He'd been told not to go. He'd been told Hitler cannot be trusted. He went anyways. He was fooled. And this is an amazing photograph signed by Hitler to Mackenzie King. It's at the Library Archives Canada, as it's called now. And I wanted to, that sickening thing, I wanted to put up this image just to show Mackenzie King is not giving the Hitler salute there at an event. Mackenzie King was a great appeaser, as was Roosevelt, of course. They didn't want war. They knew their people did not want war. They were willing to sacrifice Czechoslovakia and countries like that, Austria, Poland. Why would we go to war over Poland? And yet, of course, that's exactly what happened when Germany invaded Poland, early September of 39, which drags Britain and France into the war. And that is why, of course, Canada's at war. We have control over our foreign policy from 1931. But really, we are going to stand by Britain. English Canada would have demanded that. Although the House of Commons debates are really interesting, and you can look at them. They're all online. Take a big dig in to find them. The discussions, and one of the interesting strands I found, which I'd never noticed before, I'd read them in the past many years ago, is that some French-Canadian MPs said, why are we going to war? Look at the United States. We are connected to them. They're not going to war. And yet, of course, it was really our decision, and we do go to war, and it becomes our war as much as Britain's war. The great question is, what will the United States do? And I imagine you know this, but of course they remain neutral. And King feels betrayed by Roosevelt. But the strong neutrality laws in the United States, the sense that they felt they had been tricked into going into the First World War by machinations of diplomacy or even the merchants of death and others. And we shouldn't discount that the US military was only the 19th largest army in the world in 1939. Isn't that remarkable? It had been strangled a bit like Canada had strangled its military to ensure that it could not send large expeditionary forces abroad. We quickly began to build up our military and to begin to charge our industrial front, which had withered during the Depression years. And while the Americans remain neutral, Roosevelt understands that he should support Canada because the doomsday scenario, of course, is that if Britain should fall and Canada should be invaded, they will have Nazi Germany on the northern border. And so the Americans do send us some obsolete tanks, which we have one at the War Museum, quite interesting. This at least will be the strategy and the hope that Britain and France will hold out on the Western Front for 3-4 years like they had during the First World War. But that changes, of course, in May of 1940 with the Blitzkrieg, the rapid collapse, the catastrophic collapse of France, the retreat of the British from Dunkirk. The American Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, called France's defeat the most shocking single event of the war. There's a lot of shocking events for the US. Why is it so shocking? It's that the US have based their whole grand strategy in Europe on the fact that France will hold off with Britain, Germany. So everything changes overnight. And it certainly changes for Canada. We bring in, we mobilize our industry, we bring in limited conscription, we send a second division overseas. One was already there defending England. You'll remember when the British Army retreats from Dunkirk, they leave behind almost all their artillery, their trucks, their heavy machinery. They are nearly naked when they retreat back to the island. And the Canadian division is actually playing a critical role, almost as a mobile fighting force. Very interesting to look at Andrew McNaughton's papers on this. But still, that is what our military looks like, to use a good hockey metaphor or cartoon there. We are ill prepared. Now, what's really interesting, I think, is that we realize, and this is a theme that comes true time and time again, that we sacrifice our own security to send our best forces to Britain. So we send that second division. Some interesting questions where we send garrison forces to Iceland. And I talk about them in the book, about, the Americans are very unhappy with that, and Greenland as well. And that big island off the Canadian coast, Newfoundland, a separate dominion, which I'll talk about in a bit. All of this, I mean, if we just pause for a second, imagine you're in the White House and you've got a country at war on your northern border where the senior ally, Britain, looks like it will be defeated in June and July and August. If you were betting, if we didn't know how that war would end up, it certainly looks like Britain will sue for or surrender and perhaps even be defeated. And so Canada's wartime strategy is to send our forces overseas. And it's really neat to look in the cabinet papers, and they're really worried about what Washington will think, because we're sending all of our best forces over there, who could be wiped out. Imagine if Britain falls. 2 Canadian divisions, that's 40,000 soldiers. They would be annihilated as a fighting force, captured, held probably, knowing the Nazis, in some blackmail. And what would Canada have done? Well, there's a fascinating series of correspondence in that desperate summer where Roosevelt leans on Mackenzie King, where diplomats are running back and forth. What will Canada do? What will happen to the Royal Navy is a great concern in Washington. If Germany captures it, along with the French Navy, can certainly threaten North America. Our greatest shield will be pierced at that point. And poor Mackenzie King gets stuck in the middle of this. Roosevelt asks him gently and then not so gently, could you write to this new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, about what he will do with the Royal Navy if Britain is invaded? Would he sail it to Canada or Bermuda? And Mackenzie King, that's a loathsome thought. He cannot believe that Britain will collapse, but he understands that he has to find out what the plans are. So he writes this agonizing letter to Churchill. And it's in all this passive language that King was so famous for, backward sentences where he's trying to skate around the issue. But it is ultimately, if you are defeated and your people put to the sword, would you mind sailing the Royal Navy to Canada? And we will keep up that fight for you. That's Roosevelt's sentiments. And King sees right through it. He knows Roosevelt only wants to protect the United States, but he sends it. And Churchill doesn't reply directly, immediately. He saves it for a few days later in the British House of Commons on the 4th of June. He gives his speech. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight on the streets. We will fight. We will fight. We will never surrender. Great speech. Maybe the greatest speech in the English language. Maybe you got a better one? You can tell me later. I think it's the best speech I've ever heard. Delivered in the most important period by the most important person of the 20th century. And it's directed for the British people. It's directed against Churchill. It's directed against Churchill's wobbly cabinet ministers. And it's directed against Roosevelt and Mackenzie King. Those are the tough stakes that are happening in that summer. And I explore them in the book in more detail, of which there's a great copy for sale over there, should you feel the urge for a great Christmas present, signed, sealed, and delivered. Of course, the United States is still neutral, but I really like this cartoon. So happy when I found it, of Britain, old man Britain with this, I don't know why they've got big logs, but that's what they do, I guess, back in the olden days, carrying logs around. And there's young Canada picking up the back end, which was what? France's place. We are there, and we begin our wartime industry to kick into high gear. And this is quite an astonishing story that I write about, I think, our wartime industry. There's no single book written on this, at least not in many, many decades. And I talked to Jack Granatstein, the greatest Canadian historian, greatest military historian, greatest diplomatic historian. Maybe he and Charles Stacey could fight over that. And Jack has written some on this, but there's a lot more to be said. And I was astonished by this. At one point, I thought about scrapping the book entirely and just writing about Canadian wartime industry. But an old colleague of mine, Martin Auger, has written a 2 or 3 volume history on aircraft production in Canada, which has not been published. And I worried that it might have come out at some point, or that he wanted to put it out. So anyways, it's a part of the book. And it's very clear that our wartime industry relies heavily on the United States. First, the integrated automobile industry. We think of the Auto Pact from '65, but it's before that. And the major car producers transitioned very quickly into creating military vehicles and other things, 25-pounders there, merchant ship production, which is quite astonishing. And I'll come back to this in a little more detail later. One of the interesting elements I found just in research, one of those moments when you see something, and I love this when you're in the archives and you're researching and you find something. Every once in a while, someone finds something and you hear them go, "Fuck yeah," or something like that, right? They're just, that's it. That's what they needed. I didn't say that, but I did do one of those like, yeah, this is interesting. And it was about machinery and tools, complex tools. When France fell, all of this complex machinery was supposed to go to France. Well, it couldn't go there anymore. It was occupied. It all came north to Canada. About 40,000, I suppose you'd call them machinery, complex tools. It's critical for our factories. And that's one of the ways the Americans helped us. They help us in other ways, and I talk about that in the book, and our contributions during the war, tens of millions of shells. Maybe our greatest contribution, 850,000 trucks and wheeled vehicles. The CMP, the Canadian-made pattern truck, about 450,000 of those made. We've got one at the War Museum. Well, we have several. But it's really quite interesting, and they're used everywhere, including, and you won't find this in many history books, Monty's 8th Army in North Africa in late 1942. Half of the 8th Army is using Canadian-made trucks. That's an important contribution. And it continues. Wartime economy, which I talk about, our industries charging forward. I have a really interesting chapter, I thought it was interesting at least, on wartime culture, the National Film Board, the CBC, the creation of cultural products, both as shield and sword. Shield to protect us from American films, sword to carve out a space for us, to tell our comrades, in the United States and Britain, of what we are doing. Those National Film Board films are amazing. And they're all online, you can see them. You can see the ones that are directly geared towards the United States. And I forget the number now in the book, I have it, but they are seen by millions and millions of Americans. And that's who we're really interested in with the film production, less so than Britain. And Canadians too, of course. Canadians need to know what we're doing in this war. So we continue this wartime production, about 1 million men, about 250,000 women in direct wartime production in the factories, another 2 million involved in secondary work industry. If you add to that the 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, it's about 4.3, 4.4 million. That's almost every single adult male and woman in this country. That's the total war effort, that unlimited war effort that we talk about. And it produces astonishing collections. 410 merchant ships, similar in size to those Liberty ships, the American-made ones, where they made 2,700 of them. 16,400 aircraft, fascinating aircraft production, including about 1,500 for the US Navy, Helldivers and Catalinas. Those are important in the war in Pacific. 315,000 machine guns, hundreds of millions of shells, as I said, the sextons that you see on here. This is a staggering production. And it's almost completely unknown. I've spoken hundreds of talks, US, Britain, others. Whenever you talk about Canada's contributions in the Second World War, very little understanding other than Dieppe and maybe Juno Beach now and Hong Kong and a few other things. Almost nothing from our home front production seems to register with most scholars. And I was talking to many American colleagues who are military historians who, at least being nice to me, profess that a lot of this was new to them. And I think, in fact, it is. Now, okay, pivoting from production, there are really interesting questions of sovereignty that I address in the book. How will we work with the Americans? Right? Because one of the key arguments I have in the book, which is a little different than the previous argument, which was made by Jack Granatstein in the late 1980s, where he said Britain's weakness forces Canada into the arms of the US. And that's true. But I think the argument I make is Canada's strategic objectives in this war is to keep Britain in the war. But to do that, we have to lean into the United States. A bit of a different argument. That doesn't negate the fact that Britain was weak and needed us, but it is the key maneuvering, that delicate dance between Canada and the United States, which is critical, I think, in certainly supercharging our wartime economies, protecting the East Coast, the West Coast, the North. A really neat question. Think of the Alaska Highway, which was built during the war. This is a poster by A.Y. Jackson. The New North, you won't be able to read this unless you got super eyesight. The doors of the Canadian North open on Asia and Europe. The Alaska Highway, new airfields, oil and mineral developments make this area a strategic center, both for war needs and the future. Our northern flying routes link the continents together and make Canada a focal point in the new air age. That's a good paragraph. And the North is a really interesting place to explore, and I write about it in a couple chapters. The building of the Alaska Highway, an engineering feat. About 30,000 Americans who are in the North as part of this Alaska Highway building and aircraft movement. It's worrisome to Ottawa. It's a lot of Americans on our soil. And Roosevelt wanted even more. But King said no several times, but not to the Alaska Highway. And it became a little less funny still when the American troops began to answer the phone with the cheeky greeting of "Hello, Army of Occupation." That didn't go over well in Ottawa. They immediately send a single colonel to fly around and to land. He literally has a flag hanging outside of his aircraft. And he reports back. He says the Americans are very courteous. They're wondering what I'm doing here, but we are trying to negotiate this. The Alaska Highway was pretty useless. Almost nobody uses it. It's a legacy to this day, of course. The key thing is when Hitler stabs Stalin in the back with the invasion of Russia in June of 41. It's the flying of aircraft that are being built by the North Americans in California and Ontario and other places like that. And they fly north, called the Northwest Staging Route, and they pass through many new airfields and air bases. Edmonton is a critical one, expands rapidly. 8,000 of these aircraft are flown up to Alaska, often where Soviet pilots were waiting for them to fly them almost directly to the battlefront. It's a huge contribution to our northern neighbor, the happy Russian soldier. Go check out that film. It's a good one. This is a major contribution from Canada. There's a couple of nice monuments in Alaska, Fairbanks and Nome. Not a single mention of Canada. So that air road, if there are others that go through Newfoundland over to Britain, but this is a significant one for our strange Soviet allies. This is critical. And we also send about $150 million worth of aid as well. So if the North was active, the shipping of supplies southward was frenzied. And that is one of our great strengths, of course, our enormous mineral resources. And we send aluminum and nickel and hydroelectricity, produce about 3.6 billion pounds of aluminum, which is essential for aircraft production. About a third of it goes to the US. It's critical. Hydropower, powering much of the northern industry. We don't talk much about those minerals and that mineral power, but it's clear to me that that's an area where the US needed us. And I will come back to this later, but as I was writing this book over the last couple of years, I kept thinking of where we are now in this world at war. I was thinking of Ukraine and Russia, but where once again Canada can contribute. And it is, of course, through our minerals and natural resources and power in its various forms. This is not to be forgotten, I think, in the complicated alliance system that we remain in to this day, which originates from the Second World War, although I'll talk a bit more about that. I've talked about home front production, a little bit on the politics. I haven't talked about diplomacy, although that's in the book. Fascinating story. Our late war ambassador to Washington was Lester B. Pearson. It's a neat story. Got to read through some of his diaries for that time period. There's a lot of parties going on in Washington where people talk and they share things. And that's where Lester B. Pearson and one of our great unknown generals, Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, were working to ensure that Canada was not forgotten. And that's part of this story. Just briefly on the fighting forces. As I said, 11.5 million Canadians, 1.1 million in uniform, about 100,000 serve in the Royal Canadian Navy, about 12,000 in the Merchant Navy, and we play a key role. Newfoundland as this outpost, critical, along with Halifax, St. John's, New Brunswick, no, not St. John's. St. John's, yes, sorry. Critical to protecting our warships and the supply ships in the Atlantic, which is going awfully for Canada and the Allies in 42 and 43. And over again, there's very strong scholarship on this, led by largely the historians at the Directorate of History and Heritage, or DHIST, exploring how we, the Royal Canadian Navy, often sacrificed our own security to ensure that the Royal Navy could continue to do convoys in their own waters. And this incredible contribution, despite the heavy losses, 99% of the ships successfully passed through that gauntlet of U-boats. And we know that the Royal Navy acted as convoys for 50%. The Royal Canadian Navy for 48%, 2% for the US Navy. Now, the Americans, of course, are fighting the Pacific, but they relied on Canada for that East Coast. And they certainly rely on us. In early 1942, you'll remember when Germany declares war on the United States, up and down the eastern seaboard, the professional Royal Canadian Navy knows how to run convoys, knows how to work with the RCAF, flying high cover, and the Americans are hopeless at this. And about 200 ships are sunk in about 3 months. It's a terrible slaughter. The Canadians again help the Americans in the Triangle Run and running down supplies and supply ships down to the Caribbean. A little known story, but an important contribution. And of course, even more so once the Americans are dragged into this two-front war, when Japan attacks at Pearl Harbor. In a strange twist of fate, Canada declares war on Japan before the United States does. That's a good one to use at a cocktail party, if there are still such things. But why do we do that? It's because we're at war. Right? 2 battalions, Sea Force, 2,000 soldiers at Hong Kong, fighting as part of the garrison there. They'll fight for 2 weeks before they surrender on Christmas Day, when they are annihilated as a fighting force to face 4 then brutal years in prisoner of war camps. We are in that fight, even though our contributions in the Pacific are quite light. Where they matter, though, is in defending the West Coast. And here again, Mackenzie King understood the need for Canada to stand with the US. The US is angry and furious and afraid, and he demands that a division be rushed to the West Coast. We send naval warships we cannot spare. They should be in the bow of the Atlantic. We send 4 eventually RCAF squadrons, which will serve in Alaska. We send anti-aircraft guns, which are in short supply. We send all of this to show that we are good allies. And we link our security apparatus with the Americans. And it helps to explain, but not explain away, the gross infringement on civil liberties when Canada follows the lead of the Americans when they imprison the 120,000 Japanese Americans, and we forcibly relocate about 22,000 Japanese Canadians and Japanese nationals from the West Coast. You can see that's tied into what the Americans are doing and the unified approach to hemispheric defense. And I think in the book, I call the chapter where I explore this, the victims of hemispheric defense. We fight in other campaigns. The Aleutian campaign is an interesting one where Canadians and Americans fight together in August of 43. But I continue, Matt, I guess move that slide there, talking about the bow of the Atlantic and how the importance of fortifying North America. And I want to come just back to that and to think about that. Right? We can't be sending these vast navies and armies overseas unless North America is secure. And that's a really critical element, I think. Our Air Force contributions are significant. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan that trains up 130,000 airmen, of which thousands of Americans come north to serve on the sly, lying about where they were born for the most part. But they want to be in the war, most of them before December of 41. Eventually, massive squadrons, bombers especially, but fighters, Coastal Command, fighting overseas. And one of our politicians said he hoped to emulate the American bomber forces in the US 8th Army Air Force to create an independent Air Force. We never quite got that, although we did have 6th Group. There's other great stories. But I want to wrap it up over the next couple minutes, I think. I write about 1st Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade. Maybe you remember that movie, right? Canadians and Americans fighting together, this elite fighting force. Spoke to veterans, and they said, it was a good movie, but we remembered it differently. Right? The Canadians in it are portrayed more British than the British. They're always marching around and saluting and spit and polish. And the Americans are all dirty dozen-like guys. It wasn't like that. No, they got along generally well. I have some great eyewitness accounts where they talk about explaining the importance, things you couldn't joke about. You couldn't call the Americans Yankees. The Southern guys didn't like that. And another guy says, and we set them right on not making fun of the king and the queen. right? Those are the things that matter, but they generally got along and they fought well together. But I'm going to just focus finally maybe on 1, 2, 3, 4 amphibious landings. The first one is the torch landings in November of 42, right? So that's when the US invades North Africa. And they're fraught operations. We haven't quite figured out amphibious landings. There's tremendous fear. Vichy, France, soldiers fight them. The Royal Canadian Navy sends 17 corvettes to support those landings. Again, we sacrifice our security to assist the Americans. That's not well known. Second invasion, Sicily, July 1943. 3 American divisions on the left, 3 British divisions on the right. 1st Canadian Division going up the gut. It's not supposed to do much. The British are hoping for a very quick victory, and a strange quirk of fate. Monty's 8th Army is stopped halfway up the island. The Americans, Patton, go around the long way. Falls to 1st Canadian Division to fight its way through the Badlands. And we fight well. Major General Guy Simmons in the 1st Division. Invasion of mainland Italy, September of 43. Americans on the left, British and Canadians on the right. And of course, the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day. 2 British divisions, 2 American divisions with a 3rd in support, and 3rd Canadian Division landing on Juno Beach. There we were. Allies, junior allies, yes, but we are there. Now, I hope you have a better sense of Canada's contribution and also how we worked with the Americans. If you leave tonight thinking Canada won the war on its own, that would probably be wrong. But we were significant allies. And if you think of the total military support, fighting forces, wartime industry, trade, and even later in the war, finance and giving massive loans to Britain. This is an important story, and it's our story to tell. Don't expect others to tell the story of Canadian military history. Not even a great museum, like the World War II Museum in New Orleans will do that. I called my book The Good Allies, to be fair, and I'll share a secret, because I really thought I wanted to tell the Americans about how we were good allies, and that's certainly there. But I realized that they were good allies to us. That allyship went both ways. It's important to make note of that. And in this war of utter necessity, Canada came to realize that free riding was out. It had to dig deep and sacrifice. We paid our way in treasure, in weapons, and in blood. And that was the price of being a grown-up country. Now, there are a lot of lessons, I think, in this book for the contemporary period. I'm only going to focus maybe on 2 at the moment, although I think there's more to be said. I think, especially since the announcement of yesterday of the tariffs, of finding ways to educate our strategic allies to the south. And one of the lessons from the book, and in fact, I was cottoned onto this by the great Canadian-American scholar Norman Hilmer at Carleton, who read the manuscript and gave me some great thoughts. And he said, the Americans listen when we force them to listen, when we have something they need. And you see that in this war. They need us. And so 2 lessons. One, I think, from Mackenzie King, who said in 1938, with Canada sitting on the border of a great power, it must never lose sight of the need to be ready to stand at attention to meet all joint emergencies. Right? What he meant by that is we have to be ready and reliable. Ready and reliable. And the second big lesson here, I think, and one that I perhaps delusionally hope that someone in the White House is alerted to, is to be reminded that the complex network of alliances maintained by the United States is not done out of charity. Instead, it represents a substantial multiplier of American power and a shield by which to protect the realm. That's the lesson of the Second World War, the great alliance that the Americans and the British forged with Canada as an important and consequential nation. That alliance, which continued after the war, of which Canada was a part of over and over again, NATO, NORAD, peacekeeping operations, peacemaking, to this day. That's an important lesson. There's other lessons, but I'll just end on this. A cross of sacrifice in Arlington National Cemetery. That hallowed ground. During my research, I found about 30,000 Americans served with the Canadian Armed Forces. And at least 900 were killed. 900 were killed. This cross of sacrifice marks them for the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War. Those Americans who served in the Canadian Armed Forces. Second World War, 900 killed. They died largely fighting with Canadian Army forces and in the RCAF. They served together in those bomber crews and they went down together. They relied on one another in times of great peril. A stray anecdote here. The Americans talk about the Dieppe raid, August of 1942. There's a lieutenant who's killed there. He's the first American killed on European soil. I talk about him in the book. He's an interesting young guy, a life cut short. He was with the Rangers. But at least 8 Americans died fighting with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. And probably others as well. Those Americans who served with the Canadians are hidden to history, but they are marked with this cross of sacrifice. And I think perhaps that's the greatest reminder of how the North Americans came together, paid the price in the fight to the finish, no matter the cost. And now is the time in Ottawa and Washington to band closer together, to speak loudly to that shared history, and to remember that one's good allies of the past are those of the present and also of the future. Thanks very much, everyone. So my friend and colleague Eric will tell us how questions will work.
Yes. So as always, we will move between in the room questions and then questions on Zoom. But why don't we start with questions here in the room first? Does anyone have a question for Tim this evening?
I don't know what I need the microphone now, but I'm going to make both an observation and question. My observation sort of predicates on what you're saying earlier, Tim, but given the election of a quasi-fascist dictator wannabe to the south of us, a man who has no concept of the value and contribution of the Western Alliance, you may have to change the title of your book. Where do you see this, put your crystal ball on, where do you see this going in the next few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've done a bit of thinking on this. I'll preface it by saying I'm a historian, so more comfortable looking backwards than forwards. 2 thoughts, maybe 3 thoughts. The first thought is, if I go back to my book and what I said at the end there, the Americans pay attention to us when they know what they need from us, or maybe more importantly, how we leverage what we have with them. And where is that now? It's clearly still essential minerals, and it is the defense of North America. Now, you could say and characterize Trump and his administration as you have, which probably wouldn't be wrong in a lot of ways. But security does matter to both Trump and his administration. And you can't defend the Northern Hemisphere without Canada. So the good guys better step aside, and our politicians with sharp elbows, I'm not speaking of one party or the other, we need to get down there and we need to show how we matter and why we matter. And you see this during the Second World War, where we send all of our best people there, our best generals, some of our best politicians. We focus on that. And of course, you saw that in the first Trump administration, right? We didn't just deal with the White House, you deal at the state level. Premiers to governors is crucial. Mayor to mayor, that's the stuff that convinces the White House to change. I have other thoughts too, insofar as if you look at how Trump negotiates, he comes out hot and heavy and hard, and then they tend to back off when concessions are made. We probably need to figure out what those concessions are. Clearly, the 2% question has to be addressed. What I would say about that, again, with the caveat that I'm not an expert here, but I do know something about our history. And where did we put all of our NATO resources? It was largely in defending Western Europe. And we left the Arctic largely undeveloped and unprotected. Is it good to have a battle group or to command a battle group in Latvia? Probably. That seems to be a point where we are getting some recognition. But surely the Arctic is the place where we can push harder. Because again, you can't defend it without Canada. There may be others in the room who know more and have other thoughts on that. I'm not wildly optimistic, but I have faith in our political leaders and in the civil servants and in our service personnel that they will work hard. And just a final thought, when I was in Washington, I was at our Canadian embassy there, had a really nice chat with some of the major senior service personnel. And I asked that question, how many Canadians do you think are on deployment now from the Canadian Armed Forces around the world? About 4,300. I asked them before I knew that, how many Canadians are serving with American units? They said over 1,000. Those are significant bonds as well. And finally, sorry, Eric, finally, it is better to start, and I won't change the title of the book, it's better to start from success and cooperation and all that machinery we have in place than it is to start from zero. And there's another country to the south of the United States, which is probably starting closer to zero.
Tim, I got a question for you, because there's a few questions around some of the images that you had in your slide. And I was struck by the A.Y. Jackson piece,
Right.
but also,
Can we go back to that? Nope.
Matt, can we bring it
That's
back to that? But then also the Hughes piece as well.
The Hughes piece, yes.
And, we often talk about the Group of Seven and the First World War as creating a kind of national movement of art, of modern art,
Right.
and being influenced by the battlefields, by the Canadian environment as well, of course. Did you notice in the Second World War, among the Second World War artists, and perhaps even of the older generation, thinking about or seeing the influence of American culture upon the war art that was done, given the increasing influence that the United States is having on Canadian culture?
Yeah, interesting. We have the official war art collection at the Canadian War Museum. It's a stunning collection. Comfort and Ogilvy and Law and people like that, just really amazing. And Hughes, incredible works. I wouldn't say, and I don't think any scholar has made the argument, that there is overt nationalism on the canvas. I would say that those war artists were largely depicting the Canadian forces. Now, you could make the argument, I think, and I think I have in one of my books, that by doing that, it elevates and raises our profile, and it creates a legacy of art, which is critical for understanding what we did and imagining it and reimagining it over time. All of those artists are gone. Their works remain. Most of the veterans and those who served are gone. And yet we have this great tangible history of artifacts and objects, letters and diaries, photographs and film, and works of art, huge tanks and small teddy bears and everything in between.
Mhm.
That tangible representation, I think, is important. And maybe the way to answer that question, Eric, is what if we didn't have this vast collection? What would I be showing you here? I'd be showing you American images, wouldn't I? So maybe that in itself is a great nationalizing movement from the war. And certainly we see it in other fields beyond art, especially filmmaking, and Grierson at the National Film Board, without a doubt.
Any other questions in the room? Sorry, we've got one at the back there.
Question. I'm wondering, your presentation, I think, runs on two tracks. One that Canada, the United States share this space in North America. It's logical that we would work together, and eventually, historically, over time, we've grown to get along well together, and we end up becoming the good allies. And then we also have our longest serving prime minister and America's longest serving president. They get along, and they seem to have this shared idea that this makes sense. I'm wondering, what if we don't have King and we don't have Roosevelt?
Yeah.
We've got lots of examples. We don't have to look too far of Canadian prime ministers and American presidents that don't get along or don't see eye to eye. If that were the case, do we still become the good allies in World War II?
That's a good question. And there's a couple of ways that I'll circle around it, because I'll do that old trick of just talking until I actually settle on something worthwhile saying. But certainly that is a key relationship. And look at Diefenbaker and Kennedy, right? A rancid relationship by the end. Look at the successful one of Mulrooney and two presidents, but especially with Reagan. Think of Chrétien and his sometimes on again, off again. So yes, these relationships matter. And King plays a key role. And one of the things I write in the book, giving it away now, the ending, I guess you won't buy it. I say that in examining the Canadian-American relationship, one has to raise the profile of Mackenzie King, his status as a wartime prime minister. We always think of King and Churchill. We always think of that relationship. And in this one, and he doesn't come off terribly well there, and Churchill didn't like him for all kinds of reasons. He thought he was a weakling and a weasel and all kinds of other nasty things. Although they came to like each other. They have one nice visit, I think in 1943, where Churchill, having drunk all day, and Mackenzie King, they begin dancing at night and they do a little jig together. And King writes about it in his diary in a very funny way. Those relationships matter. And so Mackenzie King and Roosevelt, that's crucial. And one of the things I pose, I think in the book, is what would have happened if that relationship was more antagonistic? What would it have done? Could the Americans still have sent those vast expeditionary forces abroad? Could we have, in supporting Britain, if that 9,000 kilometer border was like a European border with much more security? If we had siphoned off large parts of the army to protect those things, does it change the equation? I think it does. But that's the joy of sort of counterfactual what if history. It doesn't always give you the answer, but it gives you a good question.
Tim, I have a question from Angus Orford, an interesting one. He says that during the First World War, Charles Schwab of Bethlehem Steel fabricated submarines for the Royal Navy and assembled them in Canada to avoid neutrality laws. How did the Americans and their industrialists avoid neutrality laws before the US went to war in 1941?
It's a good question, Angus. So yes, neutrality laws forbade the US from trading direct weapons, although they changed those laws over time, and it's complex to allow countries, like through Lend-Lease, for instance, to come and take those weapons and take them away, which is why the Battle of the Atlantic or the Atlantic Crossing is so essential. The integration of wartime industry Canada and the US is nearly seamless, and the border all but disappears in 1942 with the trade back and forth, which benefits both Canada and the US immeasurably. Those are some of it. It disappears in December 41, of course, and then much more open there. The Americans, because they had were isolationist with strong isolationist tendencies, it took a long time, really the fall of France, before they begin to rearm in a significant way, much like Canada. And that includes wartime industry as well. However, the Americans were only too happy to take those British contracts, stealing them away from Canada to charge their wartime economy, which really pissed off Canada.
In the
Anyone
room.
else?
Yeah, I was going to say, the neutrality laws allowed cash and carry. And so that's how Britain got bankrupted. But Britain essentially paid for all of their orders, as did France. And then Canada actually acted as a delivery point, especially for aircraft. All these stories about the U.S. manufacturers delivering their aircraft to Dorval, then they're sent overseas. But cash and carry is the key. And then just as the Brits are going broke, then Roosevelt brings in Lend-Lease, of course, which removes the dollar sign. So that's how the neutrality thing works. And I was just going to comment that for a guy of my generation, the current tensions seem unbelievable because we're a common people. I mean, speaking of my own family, we're totally cross-border, completely cross-border. I have a brother in the States. I have an uncle in the States. My parents were just going to become American citizens when they went into their terminal illnesses. And so just an emotional thing. I think people forget we really are a common people. I think Rob Fisher did a study that showed a third of the Nova Scotia population moved to the States between the 1880s and the 1930s. And that continued on, through my lifetime. So it really is a screaming tragedy.
I would agree. Thanks, Raj. Yes. And maybe those intermarriages and cultural connections, and we being North Americans, that eventually reverse some of the more aggressive and terribly unhelpful ideas like tariffs, as well as maybe explaining how tariffs work to American people and who pays for them. That probably is a good education. Right. Yeah, someone's paying for them. Yeah. Maybe we got time for one last question.
Yeah, let me pose a question to you, Tim, from Ellen Miller. On the research side of things, you talk about that holy shit moment in the archives, and you find that golden nugget buried away in the files. What was your favorite holy shit moment in the archives?
I think I used a different word, but it's still good. Yeah, it's there's so many of them, and for me, it's sort of a slow drumbeat, I guess, of keep finding things that that seem to support the thesis or force you to change your thesis, because no thesis survives contact with real research, right? You have to be open to this changing idea. The big one being for me, not recognizing how the Americans were such good allies to us, right? That allyship going both ways. I'll pick one that when I read it, it really struck me, and I almost started the book with it. It was after the Americans come into the war, so right after Pearl Harbor. It's a young American from, I think, Kentucky, who is in the RCAF. He's in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And the Americans have asked the Canadians, is it okay if we take back our airmen and those in the Army? And the Canadians say, for sure, we're all on the same side. So they, in fact, run a train all through the BC ATP bases, telling the Americans, you can go back to your country and fight there. And by the way, you'll probably be paid better, which they were. And several thousand get on those trains, but like 6,000 remained. 7,000 remained with the RCAF, at least. And they asked one guy, and he says something like, I think I'll stay. We're all fighting the same enemy. And I thought that just kind of sums it up for me. So when you find those moments, and there's lots of them, it's a great feeling. So I guess it's one of the reasons why I like being a historian. There's a bit of detective work involved. Not a bit, there's a lot of detective work without probably the danger other than paper cuts. And you're always discovering things, and it's amazing, you know? You feel like you're putting this together. And there's all kinds of metaphors or ideas. People have asked me, do you feel like you're building a house? Are you doing this or that? And I have always thought of it, maybe wrongly, as a great block of stone. And I'm sort of carving away at it to see the history that's in there. And as you work on it, and as you begin to see the form and function of this thing that you are creating. And I really like that. It feels like it for me. The other thing I really like, because research is fun. You'll never meet a historian who doesn't like to research. The other side is writing. I know a lot of historians who don't like writing. And they probably picked the wrong profession, because you got to write. And I love writing. I love sitting there every day. If I don't write every day, I feel like I've failed myself and all of you. That's not true, just myself. And so that's important. And you have to write every day or something close to it if you're gonna produce stuff. Because if you're just reading and discovering, you just become that annoying guy at the dinner party, telling people stories, right? There is an art for taking the mass of information and pulling it down into a narrative that makes sense and that people will want to read. And that is a great part of being a historian. And the third part that nobody likes is the editing process. And that's just agony. I've never met a historian who liked it. But as my good friend Serge Derflanger from the University of Ottawa says, there is no good writing, there's only good editing. All right, over and over again. Thanks, everyone. That was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for an excellent talk tonight, as always. Before everyone runs off, I'll ask Matt to please just share the URL for the folks that are tuning in on Zoom for those that are able to, that want to buy books online. But for those here in the room, the bookshelf is here, as I mentioned, to sell The Good Allies, which Tim has given a great preview to, but will be an excellent read over the Christmas holiday, but also a great gift for anyone who is interested in Canadian history. We'll also sweeten the pot a little bit in that we have a few books of Tim's that we've collected over the years from the many talks that he has come to give for us. And if you buy The Good Allies from the bookshelf, we will give you another one of Tim's books of your choosing for 50% off. So please make your way to the books, and we will also set up a little booth for Tim to sign those copies for you. Otherwise, from everyone here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, we want to wish you all the very best during this holiday season. Happy New Year, and we will see you back here in January. Good night, everybody.